Women of Wyoming Then and Now is brought to you by the Wyoming Historical Society and supported in part by a grant from the Wyoming Cultural Trust Fund, a program of the Department of State Parks and Cultural Resources. This program features unique female perspectives on events, themes, or narratives related to state history. We, the host, believe that one woman's action toward a better future can result in a greater legacy that inspires and equips many generations of women to come. Hi everyone, I am Janelle Molony, author and historian, and today's host of Women of Wyoming Then and Now. And with me today is my co-host, Linda Fabian of the Wyoming State Historical Society. And also our special guest is Jane Nelson, who's a family historian, and she is a fifth-generation Wyomingite. She's retired from the University of Wyoming and is currently associated with the Albany County Historical Society, and she just co-edited a recently published book. Welcome, Jane.
Hey, I welcome everybody who is watching this, and I'm going to be talking about two things. One is my great-grandmother and her sisters who came to Wyoming in the 1870s. And then the other person I'm talking about is myself, and how I am learning from their history and their stories how to become a local and regional historian, with a special interest in the socioeconomic history of women in Wyoming.
Hi, Jane. It's nice to see you again. Most of our work together has been through your membership in the Wyoming Historical Society, and of course, when you were president of the Albany County chapter. We really appreciate your devotion to history, Wyoming history in particular, and I'm very excited to hear what you have to say.
I consider to be a fairly recent historian of local history. So I'm still learning, but at least I'm now brave enough to write and publish about it.
That's interesting, Jane. Why do you call yourself a recent historian? You have this very extensive history of, in your career, of doing amazing things for students and education and promoting learning. So how is it now that you just recently consider yourself a historian?
Well, professionally, you know, the doing of history as a professional is very different, for instance, from being a professor of literature. And I have run into all kinds of issues trying to turn myself into a historian, realizing, for instance, that I have to be tied to facts, and that I can't present beliefs as facts. And what I have to do, I've set myself the personal task of trying to find 3 independent sources for every fact I'm going to present. That's almost impossible. The commitment to historical truth is new to me.
Very well said. Yeah, that triangulation really helps us to feel very confident about what we discover. Sometimes it's not always available, though.
I never considered myself a socioeconomic historian, not in a million years. Now I'm trying to become a socioeconomic historian.
So professionally at the university or in your career, you did some very extensive sociological work, research, and that included some of your ancestors who created several businesses and even grew a spirit of community in the Laramie area. We want to hear all about that. Can you tell us a little bit more about our subject for today's discussion?
Sure. In part, it's the story of my German immigrant family, great-grandmother and her 2 sisters, and their surname was Rudersdorf, a good German name. And doing that research has helped me to find ways to uncover the hidden and ignored history of women's work in the first half century of non-native settlement in Wyoming. The Rudersdorf family immigrated from Germany in 1860 first stopping in Iowa and then some 10 years later moving to Nebraska. For each of these moves, the Rudersdorfs joined and lived with a substantial number of other German immigrants who built German Catholic churches and cemeteries and established businesses that frequently involved breweries and hotels.
Of course.
Of course, German beer. Then in the mid-1870s, soon after the move to Nebraska, their father had died unexpectedly. So the mother was by herself with her 7 children. The 3 teenage daughters in the family, one by one, as they turned 16 and 17, traveled to Carbon County, Wyoming on tourist visits. The first one was visiting her brother, and then the other 2 sisters, went to visit the sisters. And a significant departure from their brothers, who were all marrying fellow German immigrants.
Mm-hmm.
They all married American-born men who had left family in the East, all by themselves for adventure in the West. Each of these men was 17 or 18 years older than the Rudersdorf teenagers, each one. Soon they all settled in the frontier village of Saratoga on the North Platte River. And I am especially interested in documenting the unpaid and the paid work that the 3 Rudersdorf sisters performed as they contributed to the development of Saratoga. Their unpaid work consisted of the all too often unrecorded domestic tasks: keeping house, bearing and raising children, and cooking. Significantly, they perform these tasks in communal or cooperative groups. So I have begun to call this kind of unpaid work collaborative domesticities, which is a mouthful, or maybe collaborative hospitality.
It's so fascinating to learn more about your personal background, Jane.
There were lots of Rudersdorfs in Iowa, plus numerous other Germans. Of course, more than 1 million Germans immigrated in the mid-19th century. It was a flight from Germany. So they're a tiny part of that huge group. The immigration of the 3 sisters to Wyoming took no planning whatsoever and did not happen in a group. And I find that really interesting and significantly different. They broke from their German tradition in that regard.
Why do you think that was the case?
I don't know. I think the absence of a father was significant.
Mm.
I don't know if their mother was difficult to get along with. They had, in Nebraska, they had some choices as they were growing into becoming a woman. They could marry fellow German immigrants, as their brothers were doing. They could go back to Wisconsin and marry fellow German immigrants. They could enter service as domestic maids or hotel workers, which several of their cousins had done. They chose instead to first follow a brother who had married a German in Wisconsin and ended up working for the UP Railroad in a station house community called Percy up near Hannah. The first woman then married another station house master, moved up the railroad 6 miles to Dana, and her task was to cook for the workers who were housed at that station house. I'm really interested all of a sudden in all of the station houses in Wyoming.
Right.
In 1870 and 1880, and the women who were expected to be the cooks. And so that was unpaid work, but it was significant, it had to be done, and that was the expectation. She divorced that guy within about maybe 8 or 9 years, not sure why.
It sounds like if we take a look at that from today's perspective, the teen girls went off on their own. They sound like runaways a little bit.
Yeah.
And then they got married to these super old guys. And taking that in stride of saying, okay, they're not quite runaways. I mean, if dad, the patriarch, the provider, has left the picture, then these very capable women at that age, very well equipped, they know what needs to get done, are enabled in a way. So the perspective is a little different. Back in the day, they're enabled. Hey, they don't need mom to support them. They know exactly what they need to do. They can wash a dish, they can wash laundry, they can get things going, they can cook, and they've got some good German recipes, I'm sure.
I think it has a lot to do with family dynamics, but there's no way to uncover what that is. So just to finish the comment about unpaid work, I have recently discovered a methodology that helps to uncover women's work. And we all know it as the Venn diagrams. And in sociology, they have expanded that concept and call it a sociogram. And I have created a starting sociogram to depict the social relationships in Saratoga from 1880 to 1900.
Oh my goodness.
So you can see those ovals and you see that they overlap. And then each oval can represent, for instance, a single person, or in my case, it's representing one of the sisters and her husband and their children. And it depicts the very complex relationships that families in Saratoga had with each other. And so in the process of creating that sociogram, the role of women all of a sudden becomes heightened and evident. And all of the sibling groups helped to make Saratoga into a thriving community that lasted. Yeah.
Really important. Those family bonds are really, really important for becoming sort of a glue in a new society like you're discussing. We're starting things up. We're starting to develop. We're starting to upgrade. And it's not doing business with strangers. It's doing business with family. And that creates a different level of bond that makes the social structure a little bit stronger, at least to get going.
Right. I agree. I've often used the word glue in my mind. So I'm glad you said it out loud. Mm-hmm. Well, so Christina, my great-great-grandmother, and her husband, John Mollison, created a very thriving ranch, large ranch through homesteads. Christina filed on a homestead, and John did. They had about 1,000 acres, that they were dealing with, and lots of sheep and lots of cattle and lots of vegetables. And then in the mid-1890s, the Depression hit. It was a nationwide depression lasting from 1893 to 1897, and it severely disrupted what the Rudersdorf sisters had created. One of the sisters got remarried, and she and her husband left and went back to New Hampshire because of that depression. The Mollisons lost their ranch completely, and both of the spouses of the two Rudersdorf sisters who were left had to change their careers, just upended what they were doing and had to change. Christina began to get paid for her domestic work, partly because she no longer had a husband around, and partly, I think, to try to earn some money. Mm-hmm. Her first venture was to purchase a restaurant in Saratoga, which she renamed the Home Dairy Restaurant, which I think is a really interesting name. That lasted 5 months, like restaurants do.
Uh-huh.
She then purchased a hotel in Walcott Junction, which was a important sheep center and also a transportation center. She successfully ran that hotel and sold it for a profit of $4,000 a year later. And then when the family moved from Saratoga to Laramie, because Mollison was working for the Forest Service, and the Forest Service established its headquarters in Laramie, he then died in 1912, and she turned her home into a boarding house.
So wait, as soon as she gets to settle down, she says, my husband, who just keeps going from place to place, job to job, we finally get to settle down at a headquarters, and then poof, now he's gone.
Right.
And now what do I do?
She was left destitute in a typical way. They had no cash. They were land rich. He owned 720 acres in the Medicine Bow Range, but that doesn't give you any money. So she established a boarding house, and she was able to fulfill her dream that her 3 youngest children would all graduate from the university. Her boarders were all men, university students, and she also hosted about 30 to 50 university students every Sunday for Sunday dinner, and her boarders loved her dearly.
Jane, how do you think that the work that you've done so far, and not just literally the stories you found, but the process and the growth that you found, how do you think that sharing this will impact future generations of researchers? Yeah.
So my first lesson that I've learned is that we've talked about the unpaid domestic work of cooking and housekeeping plays a significant role. And we need to acknowledge that and try to document it. I think we also need to trace the ownership and management of restaurants and hotels in Wyoming, the history of Wyoming. They're frequently owned by females or by a husband and wife team. And the restaurant that Christina owned, I have researched what happened to that restaurant, and it has a very interesting history. The 2 following owners were also female. They were also German immigrants, and they were trying to help support their families.
Jane, in your research, did you find that these women business owners had the respect of the community?
So I do know that her boarders loved her, and she was respected for that boarding house. Boarding houses is the 3rd lesson that I'm learning. Boarding houses need some historical attention. And the University of Wyoming could not have existed at all in its first few decades without Laramie community members, primarily women, providing board and room for the students. The university itself did not do that. So I think that would be an interesting task.
On a personal level, strictly personal, how do you know that your family history has impacted you and your chosen field?
It was the inspiration for my attempt to become a historian. One of her daughters wrote a memoir, which is why I know so much about Christina.
Is this the one you have a photo of?
No, I do. So here is Christina and her 2 youngest. And the taller one is Margaret. And Margaret actually became a deputy superintendent of public instruction in Wyoming in about 1919. Then she got married and left the state. But she graduated from the University of Wyoming, as did the younger daughter, who is my grandmother. So Margaret wrote a memoir. Interestingly, the memoir was intended to tell the story of her father, John Mollison. It very quickly turned into the story of her mother. Because by the time Margaret was born in 1894, and then my grandmother in 1898, Mollison was an absentee father when he was home. So her mother came to dominate the memoir, and I've moved past the memoir to try to actually write a socioeconomic account of some of this stuff. So from the personal memoir, which is full of wonderful stories, and I've been able to verify that it's accurate by looking this stuff up and finding other sources. I became really quite enraptured by the story, particularly of John Mollison, for a long time. And then in the middle of doing that research, I said to myself, my gosh, he has a wife.
Right.
Wow.
With that sociogram that you showed us that kind of looked like a daisy with the 5
Right.
circles interlocking, it seems like when you were doing your research, it was almost like spheres of influence,
Right.
which is something I think maybe comes from your background and your career, where when we're doing our little itty bitty, I'm just researching grandma type exploration, there are spheres of influence on that person, but also that person influenced others. So I find it interesting that you actually expanded on that and even took on a project to write all about territorial pioneers in the Laramie area and expanded on who was all there and how potentially they all influenced each other, and all of the stories that we have that we think are just ours and who's going to read or care, they all really do overlap and they all really do matter.
It's true that you look at those and you look at those and you realize pretty soon that, oh yeah, they appear in other people's stories as well. So it's all interconnected.
So Jane, now more than ever, like you mentioned with Ancestry and online resources and archives, we get to access a wealth of historical data and stories, not just about our ancestors, but all those who have been included in that sphere of influence, like you mentioned earlier, and all these stories of women who came before us. But if we currently don't do anything about the history that we are observing or making or finding in those boxes in the attic or in those memoirs, we run the risk of losing these very meaningful female perspectives, like you were mentioning, the unpaid work that supported everything that was created and done almost. So in 1 or 2 final thoughts, can you share an encouragement to someone who might want to preserve or even correct or explore their own personal or local history?
Oh, sure. I try to do that all the time. So my one word is to write it down. Or perhaps these days, videotape yourself talking. So yeah, the collection, the stuff in the attic. So a tiny step is to donate that to an archive.
Exactly.
And then then it has the possibility for other people to find it. And I will take the step and donate the stuff I currently have in my closet, 2 full closets full, to the archives. So in addition to writing about the archives that they find in the attics, they also need to write their stories down. Mm-hmm. Write a memoir. Start with fragments of sentences. Don't even use full sentences. And pretty soon you'll be writing.
Wonderful.
Well, ladies, that's all the time that we have for in today's discussion, but I know there is so much more to be discovered when we take a look back into our past, and if anyone wants to take a look into what Jane is working on, of course, she's got her books available. There's actually a few. We'll put links to go with the show. We are delighted to have had the opportunity to talk to you, Jane, about your family and the impact that they have had on Wyoming and the businesses, the economy, and also for the students of University of Wyoming. What a great legacy. Thank you, Jane. Thank you so much. Thank you, Linda, for joining us today.
Thank you, Jane. It was so wonderful learning more about you. I mean, I just got goosebumps. It's just so exciting.